Good morning. I'm Todd Latham. I'm the publisher of Water Canada and the president of Actual Media, and welcome to the Blue Economy series, our third in the series on governing the blue economy. Before we get started today, I just wanted to help you navigate what we're doing on Crowdcast. You'll see the chat has already started on the right-hand side. Make sure you say hello to everybody. We've got a pretty big audience today, so we're very happy to be carrying this conversation across the country. Obviously, follow Actual Media up in the top. You can ask a question down below. There are a couple of polls that you can feel free to answer. There's links. One just popped up now for Water Canada. You'll see these throughout the hour-long webinar today. Those will link to important links, obviously, of our speakers, but also content that we're covering today. So without further ado, again, welcome to a third in our Blue Economy series on governance. We're going to be bringing on our speakers. Of course, it's St. Patrick's Day, so Robert has got his appropriate attire on. Just to give you some context, going back, our first in the series was on January 20th, and we defined the blue economy, and in that we urged people to expand the definition beyond oceans. Kalpna is now joining us. Hi, Kalpna. The second in the series, which was on February 17th, we talked about what it means to build the blue economy and the many sectors and opportunities there are to drive employment in the business of water. And I see, I saw Indra join and he's bounced back out. But before I formally introduce all our speakers and get started, I do want to acknowledge the many First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada as the original water stewards of this great country. And I'm in Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. So take a moment and acknowledge wherever you're coming from across Canada or the United States or around the world, the original founders of these great water resources that we have today. So let's dive right into water governance. And I'm going to just go around the horn with Robert. Thank you very much again for your ode to St. Patrick's Day today. I'm going to start with you, actually. Each of you will get a few minutes to introduce yourselves more formally, what you do, and what your thoughts are initially on water governance before we jump into some Q&A. So, Robert, over to you first.
Well, great. Thank you. I know you started this early, so you get me while I'm still sober. So this is good. I'm Robert Haller. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association. Really excited to be part of this panel. These are three people, good friends of mine, all of you, that I can't even think of a better dinner party group that I'd love to be sitting around a table having a dinner, and maybe we'll approach it like we're just having dinner tonight and chatting. We are the professional association for the Canadian water and wastewater utility sector and stormwater as well. We represent the professionals all across Canada. We work with all the provincial and regional associations, but then who work with their provincial governments because of the way the federal and provincial governments are set up in Canada. It's important that we have both, that our members work on their provincial policies and legislation, and then we speak on behalf of the industry at the federal level, working on drinking water guidelines, effluent regulations, a lot around infrastructure funding. So those are the national issues that we're looking at, and coordinating work and discussion on climate change, on security, on infrastructure planning and municipal utility leadership. So those are the types of things we do. We've been excited that in the last several years, there's been a lot of national activity, a lot of national leadership on the issue of water, whether it was focusing on the First Nations, increased funding in infrastructure, and now a look at the Canada Water Agency. And we see a lot of great potential in that to better collaborate what's happening on a national level. There's people that are worried and naysayers, but I think there's a lot of great potential going to come out of this Canada Water Agency, and I think we'll talk about that more today.
Yes.
So thanks for having me here.
Over to you, Kalpna.
Good morning, everyone. So I am in Burnaby, BC, located on the unceded ancestral and unceded lands of the Hunkaninam and Squamish-speaking peoples. And I'm happy to be part of this group. And yes, Robert, one of these days when the pandemic is over, we'll have to all sit down and have dinner together. I work as the president and CEO of the Environmental Operator Certification Program. And so who are these environmental operators? And I have to say, it's almost like the best kept secret out there. These are individuals who work in water and wastewater. They work in water treatment, water distribution, wastewater collection, wastewater treatment. They are the folks behind the scenes who make life as we know it possible in Canada with safe drinking water and safe wastewater management. Um, I love this industry. I feel like Robert's kind of taken my thunder there sometimes when he talks about how he loves going to work. I'm like that too. I love my job. I love the people I work with. I love the industry. And we, at the Environmental Operator Certification Program, we oversee water and wastewater in terms of the operators and the facilities for both BC and Yukon. So our membership, it's around 4,000 members between the two jurisdictions, and our membership provides safe drinking water and wastewater management to almost 5 million people. So I looked at a couple of the previous webinars related to the blue economy. And I have to say, when you kind of look at the World Bank definition, it talks about the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth. And I basically look at it and I go, why just ocean?
Exactly.
We really should be looking, because that's something that it's water knows no boundaries. I mean, it flows from a creek into a river, into a lake, into another river possibly, and then into the ocean, with communities all along the way having an impact on the water and ultimately the ocean. And so I think I think there needs to be a more holistic approach. I mean, an example, I read this book called what was it called? It's I can't remember the title of it, but one of the things it talks about is that if you go to London and you drink water from the tap, and it's provided in London, it's provided by Thames Water, that water has probably gone through around 7 guts. So it was a little bit of an eye-opener when you think about it. And so this conversation is going to be very interesting in terms of where do the boundaries lie in terms of management of water resources, because there are no obvious boundaries. And I'm similar to Robert, I'm very encouraged with the Canada Water Agency. I'm hoping that some of the feedback that has been provided is taken into consideration. I know from attending the First Nations Water Symposium that was a concern that some First Nations groups had been consulted but were not included at the table. And so I think these are some of the things that we need to really look at in terms of if we're developing this, and I think it's a good idea, who needs to be at the table? And making sure that people, because the buy-in needs to, if people are going to be affected, they need to be buying into the process. And the only way you can get that buy-in is by including them.
Thanks,
So
Kalpna.
that's it for me.
Appreciate that. We'll definitely be diving in some of those questions and issues you just raised. So, Indra.
Hi, everyone. Indra Maharjan from Ontario Clean Water Agency. For those who don't know OCWA, we are a Crown agency under the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, operating under cost recovery model. So that's a very interesting model here in Ontario, that we are a part of the government as an operating authority with the mandate, to support governmental policies around water, wastewater operating authority, but we operate on a cost recovery model. And that allows us to do a little bit more than just a typical water wastewater operator. We promote building on the knowledge base of our 700 plus operating workforce. We also provide efficiency, innovation, and optimization services, and addressing new areas of concerns, which is under my portfolio, including climate change. Now, I think, Kalpna, I totally agree with you. Coming from Nepal, where I used to drink water from Himalayas, right? And now coming to Canada, I totally agree with you that water disregards boundaries. But if you look at the water policies here, there's a federal jurisdictions around oceans and lakes and fisheries and whatnots, and then there's a provincial jurisdictions around different functions of water, and also there's like our indigenous communities are totally connected with water in different ways and means. There's also land use of water. Municipalities have jurisdictions around water permits and water sources. So there's a whole mix of policies and authorities around the water space, and I don't see any issues around operating and functioning of these systems. And I agree with Kalpna that the focus is too much on oceans as a big resources to drive the blue economy. But I also think that I'm a big supporter of one water concept, and I like to see water as a whole system, including from source to sink, which is up. And then we can't undermine what's happening in between, because if we are too much focused on what's happening in our lakes and oceans, such as blue green algae, phosphorus increase and whatnot, I think we can't undermine in between processes, and that's where I think we need to focus a lot on how to make these systems more effective, so that the ocean water remains as we want it, right? So it's healthy, it's clean, and I think thanks Kalpna for mentioning the role of wastewater operators in that whole function, from source to discharge. They come very handily with their knowledge and everything. I also see in the areas where you want to drive innovation, where you want to drive infrastructure investment, all those, sometimes these overarching authority of different policies and different levels of government might actually have acted as a hindrance rather than promotion. So basically, looking at who's going to fund the infrastructure funding, right? Is that a federal government funding all the time? Is that a provincial government funding, or is that a municipal government funding? So, and it really impacts when you are trying to do really innovative, disruptive, projects and technologies and clean techs in water wastewater space. So I think some of those issues can be addressed if there's a synchronous areas of policies and governance.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all of you, for your introductions. There's a lot to cover here. Obviously, who's in charge of our water is one of the overarching questions, and the Canada Water Agency role. But before we get started in Q&A, I just thought maybe for everybody that we can actually define water governance. So I found this definition. I think it's very appropriate. Water governance refers to the decision-making process we follow, whereas water management refers to the operational approaches we adopt. So I think governance refers to how we make decisions on who gets to decide, and management refers to the models, principles, and information we use to make those decisions. So let's make sure we're talking about governance today, because that is the topic of our conversation. The other things are more around the issue of management. So on the topic of governance, how can we've talked, obviously, you mentioned in your introductions that water is largely a provincial mandate, other than the federal role in oceans and boundary waters and navigable waters and in parks, national parks. Water is a provincial jurisdiction. So we're in a situation now where we've got overlapping jurisdictional silos that I think are preventing us from adopting best practices on governance. So I'm going to throw that over to the three of you. How can we break down those geographical silos and avoid politically influenced water decisions and regulation? Who wants to take that one first?
Well, I was making some notes. I think I've got about 100 pages of notes I'd like to say on this topic. But
go ahead.
Yeah, we can get into a wish, but it is what it is. And I don't think we're going to mess with the Constitution Act. To open that up causes a million other things to go on. But we're in the middle, well, we're not in the middle, we're deep into a climate crisis, and we don't have the luxury of playing around with that inefficiency anymore. As we prepared comments on the Canada Water Agency, and I was very lucky to be part of a collaborative group across Canada of environmental groups that put in our comments, and we stopped and we put in a preamble about this is urgent. This is climate change. We can't work in these silos anymore. And that's why I'm most excited about the Canada Water Agency. You know, it has served us fairly well. This is a huge country with massive geographic differences. One size does not fit all. Somebody at a kiosk in Ottawa cannot make a policy that works for everyone. It doesn't even work at a provincial level quite often if you say one size fits all. So having it centralized isn't necessarily the answer. I think there are examples like the drinking water guidelines where all the provinces and territories work together. They come up with an agreement on direction and guidance on safe drinking water, and then that's rolled out to each province, and each one can adjust it a little bit. You know, one area tests for a lot more things than another because, you know, in Toronto they're testing for 52 items, and in Newfoundland only 12 because those only 12 exist in Newfoundland. So there needs to be a flexibility built into this, but there needs to be a breaking down of those silos and a lot more what they're calling collaborative federalism, which I really like that term, where the federal government and the provinces are agreeing on working on something together. We're rolling out the effluent regulations. You know, we talk about levels of government with First Nations and recognizing them as a government level and that is part of this process. What we're seeing with the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority is really exciting as to new governance model and how decisions will be made in the First Nations sector. So we come back to ours. I got federal, I got provincial, then I have municipal. And then within the municipal area, which is my area, you know, we just had a long discussion around governance models. And I will always insist there's privatization is one thing, but there's contracting. So privatization means I think water should always stay in the hands of the public, that the public needs to have a say through a model, whether that is directly through their municipal council and then the council decides, do we have our own staff do it or do we contract somebody? We can contract OCWA, we can contract Veolia Water, we can contract anybody to do the management operations, but the governance, the decision-making has to be always controlled by the people. And then there are models that provide a little better management, that run it more like a corporation, maybe take it out of the hands of the elected politicians at the municipal council. It's a balance where you still need to have the public engaged and having a say on their water and their rates and the levels of service, but maybe you're not sitting around the table competing with recreation and transit and all the other municipal things. We can get into later about finance divisions, but just on governance decisions, we're seeing more and more standalone water corporations that are owned by the municipality that can function better, can get better loans, can manage better, can plan for the future better if they are focused as a utility corporation rather than just a department of a town.
That's a great segue. I'm going to throw this over to you, Indra, because you are basically a water utility agency, arm's length from the government. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how that works and how you propose to break down some of these silos in water governance?
Yeah, so I think I will answer it from my personal opinion plus the company perspective, like working as an employee of OCWA. And I totally agree with Robert. Like, I like to see the governance from three angles. One is, I usually call it as 3 I's. One is investment in infrastructure. Second is innovation. And then third is issues. So I think these 3 I's needs to be looked at when you think about governance. So does this system really needs a huge investment? And that kind of determines who's going to govern it. And I think it's right to say that whoever puts in more money must get the right to say a little bit more, right? Or govern it more, or play a little bit influential role in decision making. And then when you look at the issues, like I was reading this report from Global Risks Report 2020, and for the last 5 years, extreme weather has been highlighted as one of the key risks. So now our infrastructures are in a forefront of these risks. So in terms of risk mitigation now, I think that's where governance should be reflected too. It just can't be a traditional way of looking, okay, we need to manage this, we need to make the decision. But I would like to ask questions to those people like, okay, how are you looking for investment perspective? Are you looking from impact and issues perspective, or are you looking from innovating, like driving innovation and efficiencies perspective? And the reason I'm saying is, we all know that economies of scale plays a big role, but but it can't be so big that you can't manage either because of the differentiation between local needs and localization and regionalization. So we have seen a lot of time, like one thing I agree with Robert is, when we have a utility model, whether it's a municipal boards like Union Water Supply System or Lambton Water Area Supply System, which manages most of the Southern Ontario water systems, comprised of different municipal representatives, the decisions are made more easily. And I think it has more agile model to make timely decisions that will impact investment decisions, that will impact promoting innovation and fostering innovation, and also addressing the impacts. Now I'm using a term impact as a general term. We can put it as a climate change impacts, concerns of emerging contaminants, PFAS, microplastics. You can name a whole bunch of impact. I'm just putting it as general. So I think those three needs to be looked when we answer the governance question. And I believe whoever has a more investment to make needs to have more say. And some of these issues, like investment, innovation, and impact, are overarching issues. It doesn't have boundaries. So it's a really complicated answer, to be honest with you. But as I said, I've always seen the value around these three topics. The best value you get is when you have a little bit bigger system to manage, whether it's comprised of. So as OCWA, we do a shared service model, as you know. So we operate for the smaller municipalities, more than 100 small municipalities, we operate 150. We offer, a 0.5 FTE if they need it. But if they operate the single system, you can't break down the FTE full-time resource into a 0.75. Then we support with central compliance, central energy and climate change and other support services, which comes at a cost, but it's a shared resources. So we have seen that it's a really interesting concept in Canada because we are so big geographically, and the local needs are so diverse and localized. So that's why I try to make it simple by looking at those three eyes.
Thanks for that. That's a good framing of it. And over to you, Kalpna, on how you think we should be breaking down some of these silos in governance. And you're coming from BC, obviously, and I know British Columbia is well ahead on the issue of shared governance, specifically with First Nations communities. So perhaps you can speak to that, and from an operator perspective, how are we governing water?
I think one of the key areas that we're seeing a lot of challenges is the small water systems. And we have something like 4,600 small water systems in British Columbia that we know of. There's probably more. So with these small water systems, very often they're not organized enough to go after the infrastructure dollars. Very often they run by, like I know of one small water system that is run by a retired school teacher because he's the only one in that community who could figure out the math in terms of the dosing and so on, and became a certified operator. So those are the ones that I really like. I think a lot of the largest systems can very often, in terms of governance, take care of themselves. The small water systems, they're really floundering. And I'm encouraged to see that in various areas, there are some regional districts that have taken on the operation of some of the small water systems. So from a governance model, we now have a larger entity. Of course, there's a big concern there because a lot of this, I think, has to do with people or groups unwilling to give up control. And so all of a sudden it's like, well, that municipality, they chlorinate. We've never chlorinated, but we have to now. So it's a matter of change, and people don't like change. And there's that whole component of change management that needs to play in. So in terms of that, but one of the things, I'll give you an example of where we've implemented a lot of collaboration. I think this is something that could be done at different levels of government. In the 70s, all the different certification groups across Canada came together and said, let's talk about how we can level the playing field. Yes, there are regional differences, but if a level 3 water treatment operator moves from New Brunswick to BC, that person should be able to work as a level 3 operator in water treatment in BC. So they looked at this, and there was a lot of collaboration. And there was a little bit of losing ground and gaining ground between the different groups, but also very, very cognizant of the fact that there are regional differences. And this group has been in place since the 70s. And basically, we have reciprocity agreements all across Canada that affects the movement of operators. And I think this is something, they've been trying to do this in the US since the 70s, and they haven't been successful. I was part of that group, and there was a fair amount of bickering and so on, and no one willing to give up power, and so it kind of fell apart. But I think one of the things that I find, like, to give you an example of silos from a governance perspective, a big challenge in BC for us is water is with Ministry of Health. Wastewater is with Ministry of Environment. Groundwater well permits are issued by Forest Lands and Natural Resources. So we've got these three groups, and the collaboration isn't there. And so this is just at the provincial level. We haven't even gotten to the federal level. So I think one of the key things, and I don't quite know what the answer is, maybe the Canada Water Agency, especially if it takes into full consideration the regional differences, maybe that is one of the solutions. But one of the big things is working in silos and unwilling or unable to collaborate. I think that is one of our biggest problems.
Yeah, very, very well said. Collaborative model is definitely where we need to go with governance, and that's actually leads us into one of the questions that somebody's posed on the question down below from Carl. Most of the problems of our water systems relate to small systems. How can we adjust our governance to change and resolve this? Is this a Canadian Water Agency issue? And greater regionalization is one answer to the small system challenge, but who should drive this? So I guess, continuing on that small systems conversation, Kalpna, is and then maybe it's part of the poll questions as well, who's really in charge of the water? Should it be regional? And are small systems going to be best served by local governance or having a federal oversight?
I think it needs to be governed somewhat locally because there are so many groups and there are so many differences. This is something that was highlighted in the Auditor General's report. There was an audit done 2 years ago in British Columbia, and this was one of the key highlights. And we were part of this audit process in terms of providing input. And it's like sometimes people kind of go like, it's small systems, like how many people does it affect? It's when you think about 4,600 small systems just in BC, that's a lot of small systems. And there was a Health Canada study that also provided information that when you look at gastrointestinal illnesses that are related, that can be traced to water, most of those are actually traced back to small water systems. So the impact is massive, and we don't even know the full extent of the impact because it isn't measured very well. So I think it kind of needs to be at the provincial level, but I think in terms of the infrastructure support, the dollars, I think that needs to be a federal priority. Because I think the money needs, I mean, there are so many other infrastructure projects for larger facilities. Why not small water systems? And the province and the health authorities have the opportunity to work with the small water systems to access these dollars. I think when there was a survey that we did a few years ago, because we were instrumental in putting together a small water systems online help center. When the small water systems operators were polled, one of the things they very clearly emphasized was they don't know how to access dollars for making infrastructure improvements.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what Kalpna said. One of the work I do is supporting our small system owners in applying to these fundings. And I think like Todd, you raised it very clearly, governance versus management. I think the management can be left to the local municipal bodies to decide who they want to get as a management of the systems. But in terms of the governance, I think provincial governance would be good because 80% of our systems are small, and they are very primitive in technology. They have simple treatment package systems and then wastewater lagoons, and enforcing them with these high requirements of sampling and everything increases the cost. And on the other side, these systems are not self-sustainable in terms of financial model, right? The rates are very low. So once you start adding a whole bunch of requirements, then it also increases cost. And then there's a, getting operators and upgrading the systems and whatnot. So recently we have seen a lot of funding programs available, but most of these funding programs are provincial and under the Pan-Canadian framework, provincial and federal combined dollars, right? So in that case, if you again back to the 3I logic I gave, if you look at the investment, I strongly believe that it should be more federal responsibility to keep these systems afloat, investing on these routinely. And I think we're starting in a good front, like Robert says. Canadian Water Agency just completed its public consultation, so there's a lot of submission, and I'm very excited reading at a lot of these submissions talking about similar discussions we're having today. And then I think yesterday the public consultation for the natural infrastructure assessment started, which is going to close down to June 30. I think it's also another opportunity for us to talk about this critical role this wastewater infrastructure plays. Now, I just want to talk, if you look at the United States recently released its infrastructure report card for wastewater systems. And if you look at those, it's funny to say that they do like a Grammy Awards, and then they give these awards. And it was really fascinating webinar to watch. But a lot of stormwater systems receive D. A lot of wastewater receive C+. And if we all have been following the discussions down there, the EPA recently appointed new leadership in EPA are coming from wastewater sectors. And there's a fundamental discussion happening of a big $1 billion of investments. And I think we are going towards the same directions, to be honest. But I think something around that will be, again, like who looks at the infrastructure as a whole? I think it should be a federal, because that's where a lot of the money sits. And then deciding on which impacts, like, there's in the province, we have a Great Lakes strategy that looks at the, Great Lakes and the quality of the water around the lakes, and it typically focusing on prosperous and all those issues. And the provincial government also has stated that they also want to see some developments around overflow and bypass monitoring. Mm-hmm. So now, like, who is going to pay for it? At the end of the day, the small system owners needs the money to do these, right? So, and then we saw that the WIJAR regulation around dechlorination and all these solutions are not cheap. And all these small systems, like it's a lot of money for them to meet these requirements. I'm not saying they should not meet. I'm just saying, there should be a collaboration between different levels of government to make it happen, not just saying it needs to happen, whether we call about workforce. And I think that's what OCWA has done a great job, is by bringing these solutions and bringing that economies of scale power into the mix. So recently we did a project in a First Nations communities where we put a lot of data systems to capture process data, flow data, which is available on my cell phone. That gives access to promote efficiency in the operations of the system. So there's a lot of overlapping areas too. But I think if you look from that 3I principle, I think it will help us to make, okay, this level of governance needs to be responsible for this topic in this setting.
Robert, I know you've been waiting to jump in on the decision-making process we should follow in Canada. I'm hearing, there is a decision-making process. Both Kalpna, I think, and Indra both said at provincial level should be the decision-making body and have the local small system operators do the management piece. Is that your view as well?
Yeah. So before I took this job on, I was over 20 years in small municipalities. So that's my background, is as a clerk, deputy CAO of small communities. What was it? Over 20 years ago, Ontario had that watertight report, and it gave some great recommendations on becoming self-sustaining. And I remember talking to somebody at the government, and I said, well, we're not viable. And their answer was, well, go get viable. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a good thought. For some, that started to turn into large centralized infrastructure, that one mega plant for big areas. And the costs of that per household were astronomical, and they didn't make any sense. So luckily that centralization has moved away, and the technology is improving for small, good, reliable, small systems that we are putting around the world. Canadian technology for small systems is world leadership. What we can share on is the management, the staffing, the SCADA oversight. Those are a lot of the reasons why I'm putting in a plug-in for OCWA. In Ontario, I went with OCWA because, I had 2 water workers. If they got sick, I was done. I went with OCWA. So there was a centralized SCADA for 40 communities in my area. And if my 2 guys were sick, 2 more came in, and then 2 more. And we worked together on the big picture stuff. But we had localized treatment plant. The workers were around there. I'll say what they're doing in Atlantic Canada, the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, is taking it from all these separate things, and they're going to work as one corporation to find solutions for many, many, many small areas. The leadership's got to be at the provincial level, just the way that we're structured. I think that leadership has to be at a provincial level. Years ago we forced municipal amalgamations, but it's about service delivery models that the province can lead. And then as provinces and federal governments make legislation, they need to use their money to push goals. That you can't just make a rule in a kiosk, I always say, and just expect us to figure out how to do it. The money's got to come with it, the financing of infrastructure funds that move communities to these better management systems and support us. We'd all rather be self-sufficient in this, that we have water rates and billing. That works in bigger communities, but in smaller communities, the cost per household breakdown of some of this infrastructure and costs gets beyond a reasonable level, and there needs to be provincial, federal assistance and that leadership to push these operational models.
Good. So I think we're all in agreement that the feds need to provide the money to the municipalities to drive governance of local and small systems.
The provincial leadership of that.
Provincial leadership of that, and that is the existing model, right? Isn't it? So I mean, provincial governments are in charge of our water, as they have the regulatory mandate. So if that's the existing structure, and we all agree that's the right way to do it, how come it's not working?
I think, like, looking at the situation in BC, and one of the key issues is a lack of collaboration or the silos between the different parts of the provincial government. And that can be a real challenge. And there's another level of complexity too, because there's a Ministry of Health, but under the Ministry of Health, there are 4 health authorities, and they work differently. They're all sort of separate fiefdoms, and they work quite differently from each other too. And so that is, I think, one of the challenges, that it isn't a level playing field. There isn't a lot of information sharing. And I think if we broke down those silos and we had more collaboration, then I think it would work a lot better. I think the silos and the lack of collaboration, I think, are real problems within the system.
Robert, Indra, how do we create more collaboration?
I think, that's in the WEO committee that I'm a part of, Utility Management Committee in WEO, the Ontario Association. We have been talking lately a lot about utility collaboration and the water, wastewater sector collaboration with other sector collaboration. For example, I have a brief work with the electric utility before I jump into OCWA, and let's talk about data now, right? We are talking about governance, and governance should be based on data. Management should be based on data. So let's see where the data sits, right? So the water data, where does the water data sits? Where does the wastewater data sits? And where does energy data sits? So we are promoting energy water nexus for a long time now. We are promoting utility benchmarking for a long time. But look at the data now. The electric data sits with 75 different local distribution companies in the province. And then the water data sits with all these water system owners, and maybe with the Ministry of Energy and Ministry of Environment. So I think I kind of agree with Kalpna is there's more collaboration needed to open up these vaults where, collaboration not just on the data, but also on the decision making. Like, the Ministry of Energy here in Ontario requires all the broader public sector report annual energy consumption and a greenhouse gas consumption under regulation. But then that data is sitting on the energy side. Then the Ministry of Environment have water, wastewater data. So we need to work to make that data cross collaborate so that there's a bigger outcome from the data working. So I won't say, Todd, that the model of provincial and municipal and federal jurisdictions or the governance is not working at all. I would say again, it is not working when we are promoting new innovative technologies. It is not working when we are promoting infrastructure investments. It is not working when we are trying to address issues like issues of emerging issues. It is working very well in terms of compliance and a regulatory role. It is working, because we have a best water in Canada. We have a big public trust in the quality of the water and the wastewater. So I won't see the regulatory part is not working. I think the other aspects might not be working and can be made better. That's how I see it.
Robert, you want to weigh in a little bit more on that, or?
Well, traditionally, municipalities were intake pipe to the outlet pipe, and that was our stuff. But it's watersheds. We have to think watersheds. Watersheds don't recognize political boundaries. I remember hitting frustration as a town manager that we had created water protection zones, intake protection zones in Ontario, and we identified where are the risks to my water source and how do we manage that risk. All the risks to my water source were outside of my municipal boundary. So I couldn't affect the zoning, the planning, the protection laws that I wanted about that. And the town where the problems were, the township, they didn't care because they were all on well and whatever was good wasn't going to affect them. And so I think we need to strengthen the watershed authorities, if it's the conservation authorities or whatever we call them. I think they need to be a lot stronger. I think they need to be empowered to force this regional protection control of our source water and so forth. Then it comes to that. One of the failures is the funding. That is my pet peeve for years. Property taxes should pay for property things. Water should pay for water. That we're paying for schools on our property tax, or we're doing income redistribution programs and housing, and that should come from income tax. And then we're going cap in hand to the provincial or federal government begging for money. So we can't plan as utilities into the long term because we're counting on grants. And meanwhile, we're paying for income distribution programs and all sorts of things that keep coming at municipalities. 90% of the infrastructure is municipal, but we get 10% of the tax. That's always one of the arguments we have. And then the rest of it, we've got to go begging for and get in line. And this is, again, where the small communities fail because they can't fight for that money the way that the large communities do. And they've got big engineering teams, either on site or contracted, that make professional applications and get that money. And so that's where it falls apart.
So that actually is that's a good lead into one of the questions that we have around the value of water, water as a commodity versus a common necessity, and just maybe open that up to the three of you on, and it goes back to Indra as one of his 3 I's was investment. If we're going to actually apply good governance and break down these silos and do the collaboration, the money's got to be there. So, how do we pay for water? You mentioned, Robert, it's not coming out of our property taxes, and people are loath to have increased water utility bills. So are we just in the cycle of cap in hand to the federal and provincial governments to fund water? What needs to change from the investment and money side of things to finance water governance?
I think one of the key things that needs to change is with regards to, we don't value our water. Like, we don't pay enough for it. I mean, you look at countries that are really strapped for water and how much they pay for water. So when you're not paying for paying for something, you tend not to value it and you tend to waste it. I mean, where I live, we have no water meters. My neighbor's sprinkler system is going on even when there's rain because it's set on an automatic schedule. It comes on certain days for a certain length of time, whether it needs it or not. And I bet that if they had to pay for their water, they would put in a rain sensor or do something like that. So I think that's one of the key things. And we've come across situations, I mean, going on various tours and so on, where there's someone's got a leaking toilet and they haven't addressed it. And this is a small community and it's ended up draining the entire reservoir over a time period, or they've left something on. So it's one of those things. I think if we don't value it, I think that's one of the key things. I think we should be paying more for our water. Think about how much we pay for other things. So I think that is one place we should be getting some more of the revenue from is actually the users. If I have a garden and I have a sprinkler system and a swimming pool and a hot tub and wash my car every week, well, I should be paying more than someone next to me who isn't doing all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of the it should be user pay.
Yeah, I agree with Kalpna, and I came across, I was doing a presentation, I came across a chart for G7 countries, and Germany has the highest rate of water, and Canada has the lowest rate of water, and then the highest consumption. So just to put it, so I grew up with the hardship of having a clean water and a proper sanitation, So this issue of paying for a water and having a water is abundant. When we immigrated here in 2010, my wife couldn't just stop washing the dishes because the water was flowing all the time. We are not used to that, right? So, but having said that, also, I don't think we can just increase the rate of water to recover and make the system financially sustainable. As I said, we have to look at the whole one water concept. So, and EOCWA, we are promoting to different revenue opportunities on the wastewater as a resource recovery and transforming the whole concept from, just looking at the treatment. So the whole concept we have here is something is coming in, I have to treat it to meet the compliance. Then my job is done. And then we don't care about resources that's in, whether we call it energy, whether it's called nutrient or other. So as you know, we're trying to do clean fuel production. We're trying to bring in food waste organics in the facilities as an additional revenue source so that there's additional revenue sources to maintain these systems, not just the rates, right? Not just the putting burden on the ratepayer, which is never going to be sustainable. So we have seen down in the United States and Europe that these models have worked, and then that extra money can be used for regular injection, efficiency and savings and optimization. So that's another thing. The other things also is basically, now the province have started across asset management and all these other work, rebuilding resiliency, collaboration with the workforces and whatnot. So I think two angles basically I see to make these systems work is obviously, we have to increase the water rates at least attached to the market inflation, and then find alternative resources of revenues, whether it's from biosolids management, whether it's from biogas management and other areas. Then finding efficiencies and reducing the operating costs. Now, if you try to find how much does it cost to produce 1 meter cube of treated water and then treat wastewater in different municipalities, you will see a whole range of numbers, right? And like some areas of like for water conservation is one of the area that I'm very passionate about, and energy as also. Like different municipalities are doing all sorts of different activities depending on how big those municipalities are around water conservation. And but I also hear other voice that, we don't want to promote water conservation because then there will be less use of water, creating a revenue impact on the revenue. So it's a very interesting dynamics here in Ontario, and it needs a broader discussion, and there's not a one silver bullet to answer. We have to look at all options available.
Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you for a one single bullet crush answer to how do we...
Well, I'm going to do a plug. Monday's World Water Day, and CWWA is releasing a guidance document for utilities called Towards a Sustainable Utility. 3 major topics. Chapter 1 is identifying all the challenges that we probably all know about. Chapter 2 is all about full cost recovery and how utilities plan to cover their costs now and into the future, and the infrastructure that needs to be redone. And part 3 is how we get that community buy-in, how we communicate with the decision makers and engage all of our stakeholders. So we're launching that on Monday, so watch for that. And we're going to have a webinar with municipal leaders like this talking about moving ourselves to sustainable utilities. So
Good. Well, I'm going to jump in. We've only got a few minutes left. I know there's a lot to talk about on water governance, but I wanted to bring up a key water governance issue, which is watershed-based delegated governance. And it was brought up earlier. Robert, I think all 3 of you have mentioned that water doesn't recognize boundaries, and we should be looking at more of a watershed approach. In Ontario, we're seeing conservation authorities, their powers diminished, and so this power shift between local watershed-based, conservation authority-based governance to provincial goes back to what we were talking about earlier of these silos. So can the 3 of you talk about, how we can achieve that local watershed conservation authority governance in the provincial mandate?
I'm kind of waiting to see what happens in BC with regards to that, because that was something that was emphasized in the auditor's report as well, is with regards to watershed. And the whole concept has changed in terms of bringing watersheds into the picture, because now everyone's talking about watershed to tap, drain to watershed. So I'm waiting to see what happens with that. But yes, that is a big component we need to, because my water is coming from another municipality's watershed, so that is a big component. So I'm waiting to see. I'm quite excited about what the outcome is going to be.
Robert, Indra?
OCWA. Yeah,
go ahead, Indra.
Yeah, OCWA has worked in last number of years with the conservation authorities and Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks to support with the objectives, that mutual objectives around nutrient management and effluent management. Just for example, as you all have seen in southwestern Ontario, with the increased number of greenhouse facilities, the phosphorus levels have gone up, and we're working with a couple of conservation authorities to try innovative solutions around how to handle that, how to make sure that it doesn't go to the freshwater bodies, around algae bloom, around cyanobacteria and different issues. So definitely that's a good place to start collaborating. What are the mutual objectives? And the other thing we also have started doing is, we talked about this governance a little bit, and a lot of people don't know what happens in between. We know where the water is being drawn from, right? Which lake, and then what happens in between. And then we just see the output in the lake again. And that's where, so what we started doing is every time we have a new councillors coming in or new director of public works coming in, we take a tour of the plant and try to show, it's basically a part of educating a decision maker, saying, this is the effort that goes in to make sure that when the water is discharged into a natural environment, these are the steps that's being taken, and it costs. There's a lot of due diligence and health and safety. And we have received such an encouraging feedback from political leaderships of small systems and large systems who have, starting with the comments saying, I've never been to the wastewater plant. I've never been to the water plant. I didn't know you guys need to do all of these. So I think when we talk about value of water, and now we have a team on OCWA employees trained that goes to grade 8, grade 7, also from 2 angles, from promoting them to join the workforce and also talking about what happens in the water plant, what happened in the wastewater plant. So I think that also helps to create that perception of value of the water. And I read it somewhere yesterday that we are so much eager to buy stacks of bottled water in Costco and Walmart, but then we don't want to pay a little bit more on the water coming out from our taps. So.
Robert, any comments on that?
I'll just go back. Our hopes for the Canada Water Agency, not only as something that will get 20 plus federal departments and agencies talking to each other, but the one of the most exciting things to come out of this, it's all been about watersheds, source protection. It's not about municipal operations, that thing, and it's not about a lot of things that will stay with their departments because they're very focused, and the federal government's doing a lot on a lot of areas. It's how do they talk to each other, but more importantly, how do we all start sharing all the information and data, not just in these federal groups, and not just then start to bring in all the provincial data, but what do all these other localized environmental groups, all these river keepers, what information and data do they have? And if we start to pool that data and make it publicly available, that the federal government's not just collecting this data for them, but they're also sharing that data, and that local environmental groups and people that care about their water and those that do want to know can get access to all that new scientific information, and that will help make decisions, and that will make us all think on this watershed basis. So if anything really awesome is coming out of Canada Water Agency, it's going to be first this collection and sharing of data.
And that's a great segue into what I was going to bring up. We've had some comments and a question around education of water, and we can't
We've
do
not
this.
planned this, right? Every time I lead you into we've not planned this.
No,
Yeah,
no.
so it sounds like everybody's putting a lot of weight on the Canada Water Agency to do all these wonderful things. It's going to be this panacea. The Canada Water Agency is going to clean up all of our governance issues. It's going to force us to collaborate, and it will educate all citizens on water conservation, protection, and water awareness in general. I think that's something that is going to have to be part of it. That was one of our questions. At this time right now, I'd like to ask everybody to let's look at the polls. So if you haven't completed the polls, please just do that now before you leave the call. I just wanted to go over them really quickly. What is the top issue that needs to be addressed in Canada? Waiting on a few more votes, but it looks like that's unequivocal that ensuring safe and reliable access to drinking water for all citizens is the top issue. Of course, boil water advisories are still in effect on many First Nations communities. That has to end. Again, back to governance. Why aren't the provincial governments doing more for their provincial First Nations territories to address that? Maybe that'll be something that comes out of the water agency as well. Climate change is taking up on top issue. Of course, that ties into it. We can't have safe water without climate resilience. Which level of government should have the biggest role in water governance? Federal is leading the way, but there is some weight in provincial and local. So I think we do need that collaboration amongst all three level and fourth level governments. We count municipal and Indigenous perhaps as separate levels of government within the provincial jurisdiction, but there is definitely a need for more collaboration by the looks of it across all levels of government. Other poll questions there relate to our stuff. At this point, I wanted to thank all three of our speakers before I start wrapping up with closing notes. One sentence, each of you. What do we do to fix governance or improve governance in Canada? One sentence. Who's going to go first?
You don't have to wait for the provincial or federal government to force you to do the right thing. As a municipal utility, you have the power to go beyond the bare minimum. Go for it if you know what's right, and work with your neighbors. Solve it internally.
Take charge. Kalpna?
I'd say collaborate and educate, especially education on the value of water.
Yeah, same with me. And I would say utility collaboration, and also cross-utility industry collaboration with different industries.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all three of you. It sounds like collaboration is the way to break down these silos and get to better governance models in Canada. Appreciate all three of you joining us. I'm going to start wrapping up a few closing items. One of them was this is the end of the webinar, but it's not the end of our discussion. This webinar will be available on recorded for 45 days. And I think, in fact, after we close out today, you'll see this video be available to replay, and all of the chat will be included in that. Next up for us is the March 25th webinar being released by our sister organization, Renew Canada. That's the Infra Intelligence on the Digital Age of Construction. That is March 25th. The next one on this water series, the fourth in this series on the blue economy, will be about innovating the blue economy. And that's going to lead up to our Canadian Water Summit event on June 8th to 10th. And that's in collaboration with our good friend Robert Holler and others at the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association. And so the next event for the blue economy is April 21st. Mark that in your calendar. Actually, if you follow Actual Media at the top right, you'll be automatically notified for that. And that's the wrap for me. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And look for more in the issue of Water Canada and on watercanada.net. Appreciate your time. See you next time.